Welcome to the Well Woman Show, where we use intersectional feminism, mindfulness, leadership, and strategy to support smart women to change the world. This is a special series of conversations about how Black and white women are navigating anti-racism. I'm your host, Giovanna Rossi. On each of these special episodes, I'll be in conversation with a Black, indigenous, or woman of color colleague, and together we'll explore anti-racism and racial justice, what it means not only in the big picture, but how our daily lives are impacted, what we're reading, what we're doing, and where we go from here. The Liberatory Consciousness Framework, created by organizational development consultant Barbara J. Love, was recently presented by Erica Hines of Every Level Leadership at a small business community forum on racial justice organized by Rachel Rogers. The framework has 4 parts: awareness, analysis, action, and accountability/allyship. As Erica Hines emphasized in her presentation, many of us aren't ready for action yet because we haven't completed the work in the awareness and analysis stages. This special series is part of my effort to raise awareness and engage in the analysis. There's a list of anti-racism resources at wellwomanlife.com/anti-racism. And you can check out all the past episodes of The Well Woman Show featuring Black, Indigenous, and women of color at wellwomanlife.com/women of color. This special series on anti-racism is part of the Podcasters for Justice campaign. We are podcasters united to condemn the tragic murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many, many others at the hands of the police. This is a continuation of the systemic racism pervasive in our country since its inception, and we're committed to standing against racism in all its forms. We believe that to be silent is to be complicit. We believe that Black lives matter. We believe that Black lives are more important than property. We believe that we have a responsibility to use our platforms to speak out against this injustice whenever and wherever we are witnesses to it. In creating digital media, we have built audiences that return week after week to hear our voices, and we'll use our voices to speak against anti-Blackness and police brutality. And we encourage our audiences to be educated, engaged, and to take action. Here are 3 things you can do right away. The first is donate to any of the following funds: George Floyd Memorial Fund, Minnesota Freedom Fund, Black Visions Collective, Campaign Zero, or Black Lives Matter. Number 2, sign a petition. You can text Floyd to 55156 to sign a petition to demand justice for George Floyd. Number 3, you can sign up at Color of Change to be notified of more opportunities to take action. You can find all of these links on the show notes at wellwomanlife.com/podcast. On the Well Woman Show this week, I share part 2 in a series of conversations with Black, Indigenous, and women of color colleagues and friends. And together we explore anti-racism and racial justice, what it means not only in the big picture, but how our daily lives are impacted, what we're reading, what we're doing, and where we go from here. This week, I'm in conversation with my colleague, Angelica Archuleta, and we are exploring racial justice from our unique perspectives and lived experiences. Angelica was born in Santa Fe, raised in Espanola, and grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. As a lupus survivor since the age of 10, her passion for human rights is rooted in her lived experiences. All the information shared today can be found at the show notes at wellwomanlife.com/210show. Including links to the first episode in this series, the list of anti-racism resources, the list of interviews with women of color, as well as how to join our community on Facebook. Again, that link is wellwomanlife.com/210show. The Well Woman Show is thankful for support from High Desert Yoga in Albuquerque. I'm speaking with Angelica Archuleta today. How are you?
Hi, I am doing great. I'm feeling really good today. It's hump day and I'm really excited to talk.
Awesome. So as we heard in the introduction, this is part of a series on how Black, Indigenous, and women of color are navigating anti-racism and in conversation with white women, me being a white woman. And Angelica, wanted to kind of just start with how are you experiencing, how are you doing with everything that's going on in the country, in the world, but also here in New Mexico. We're located in New Mexico, and there's a lot of things happening here too. How are you doing, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll definitely say that I'm taking it day by day, really. That's the best I can do. And I always want to go back and talk about how my anti-racism work kind of started. And I feel like I've been having a lot of these conversations for a really long time, but now I'm having them with people who I don't normally have them with. And so, of course, that's really, really great. And so, yeah, I'm also would like to just mention that I do identify as a New Mexican, really. I don't like to really use the term Hispanic. I will say that I do identify with many Latina and Chicana cultural characteristics. But as far as my skin color goes, I am white passing and a white presenting woman. But the other intersectionality that I speak from is of the disability section. I have been suffering with lupus since I was 10 years old and a survivor of lupus. And so that's about 19 years having that struggle. So those are the two different intersections that I really am viewing this from. So I think that's important. When I first started, going back to school and really diving into sociology, I started at CNM where I took a social movements course. So that was my first, introduction into really what you don't learn in public education. So that was just a really eye-opening experience. And from there, I just kept on going forward with learning everything that I could about racial and social justice. And when I got to UNM, I took an anti-racist course with a woman by the name of Andrea Veda, who I now consider to be a huge mentor of mine. She is a doctoral student at UNM. One of the first assignments that I remember in taking her anti-racism course was to write an essay on the first time that we felt as being an other. And so for me, that was another kind of huge stepping stone in my understanding of how I view these issues, like I said, through my intersectional lenses of being a disabled person. And so the first time that I can remember being the other was when I was diagnosed with lupus. I had it's called the butterfly rash on my cheeks. And so, I was teased. I had to do chemotherapy. I lost some of my hair. So I was teased for that. And I can remember that being the first moment that I experienced otherness. So yeah, I always really try to include that disability portion whenever I'm looking at any of these issues as well. So
yeah, that's a great kind of insight into sort of who you are and how you come to this. And it's so important to start there, I think. So thank you for that. I think exploring the otherness, from the intersectional lens is so critical. And it really brings to light all of the different kind of dominant cultures that exist. So, you as a, like you said, white presenting New Mexican have these other identities, right? Like, and disability is one of them. And being a woman is another one of them, which you didn't mention, but it's on my mind a lot because that's one of my identities.
Definitely.
Yeah. And
a hetero woman as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that's definitely a dominant culture. So it's interesting. You're part of, like, you identify with some dominant cultures and some non-dominant cultures. And so navigating that, it must be a challenge.
Yeah, and it brings me back to the liberatory consciousness model, which I think is really great. It's a really great framework to kind of conceptualize everything that's going on. And the steps really break it down. And so another thing that I learned from Andrea is, I feel like I need to be constantly working on my critical consciousness. So it really brings me back to that. And, when I first look at the stages, we've got stage 1 awareness, stage 2 analysis, stage 3 is action, and stage 4 is accountability and allyship. And at first glance, I see myself at stage 4. But then we begin to really deep dive into, like you said, the dominant cultures and the non-dominant cultures. And I feel myself still, I could be considered at the first stage. It's like a constant state of learning and re-educating and decolonizing the mind is the term that I really like to use. Is the decolonization of everything is something that I strive to do on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the liberatory consciousness framework was developed by Dr. Barbara J. Love. And I have come across this now a couple of times just in the last few days, or last, few days and weeks, through different trainings and community forums and things. And actually, you and I both participated in the Whiteness at Work training recently, and we're part of it ongoing throughout the whole month of July as part of something we're working on together in another context at work. For listeners, we work together. Angelica and I work together. So we're in our other capacity working together doing this training called Whiteness at Work. So we did the first part, and there were a lot of things that came up that were I just was like soaking up the information. And I wanted to call out a couple of things that I noticed really struck me. And one was the trainer, and it was Desiree Attaway from the Attaway group with her colleague, Jessica Fish, and they were presenting this training. And one of them quoted someone else, and I didn't catch who they were quoting, but they said, race is a strategic priority, not a moral nicety.
Yes.
And that really struck me. What did you think of that?
I think that that stood out to me as well. I think I took a note with the next thing that was mentioned. I think the willingness to hear anger and not be defensive. I think that was what really stood out to me as far as that goes as well. It just, it's something that, like I said, it goes back to the constant decolonization of the mind, and the idea of whiteness not being about individuals and as being part of a larger structure that we're all a part of, right? And we all contribute to in some way. And so unless we're actively working against that because it's already in motion, then we are just part of that same structure and that larger moving body.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you said you're sort of going through the 4 stages presented in the liberatory consciousness model and kind of revisiting some of the stages because, you go through awareness, and then, as the trainers mentioned, people like to jump right into action, and they really, really were very strongly encouraging people to slow down and really go into analysis before action. And then after action, as you pointed out, there's, the accountability and allyship piece. But you're saying like you've had the opportunity to kind of revisit some of these stages within different parts of your identity.
Definitely. Yeah. And a lot of it, I feel is me recognizing the privileges that I do have. I grew up in a the poorest county in the state, which is Rio Arriba County. And I had the opportunity to get out and move to Albuquerque. And that gave me so many more opportunities that a lot of my peers did not have. And so I was able to go to school and all these things. So I can definitely reflect on those privileges. And you have to constantly be aware of that. It's not something that, like, I can't just move into action. And I mean, of course, there's always actions that we can take.
Yeah. But
it's a constant.
Right. Like it's like, yeah, take action, but don't forget about the analysis and the deep work that needs to happen to continually be looking at these things. And just, to let listeners know kind of where I'm coming from with this is, I'm a white woman, hetero, sexual. And so I'm coming from the perspective of a lot of privilege. And I think this is where a lot of white people get really caught up and confused and like defensive. And this is where we see white fragility show up a lot, right? Which is like, hey, I've worked really hard in my life. Like I've had a lot of struggles. Why are you telling me I have all this privilege? Like I certainly don't feel like that, And right. So I would say to those folks kind of, yeah, I hear you. And what I have learned over the years, and I've been working in social justice, granted from a feminist perspective, which has its own issues with racial justice and diversity and equity. But, I do come from a social justice lens of 20 plus years. And what I came to know was that, yeah, I had a lot of struggles. Like I grew up poor. I lined up in welfare lines with my mom. I was teased for not having, the right clothes and all of that. And so, yeah, I had a lot of struggles, but none of them were because of the color of my skin.
Exactly.
And I think that's the piece that a lot of white identifying or white presenting people, it's like the big elephant in the room. It's like, that's the big piece that we need to acknowledge. And then we don't need to be defensive about it anymore. It's just like, oh yeah, right. I get it.
Right. It's, it's at this point, the numbers, the facts, the statistics, they're out there. Everything is available to you just as easy as it is to Google what restaurant you're going to eat at next, or, look up something on Amazon. You can easily just type in the numbers and see the facts laid out there for you. And then from there, I think that people are not going to be given the opportunity to argue with that. It's prevalent in every single aspect of our society, in health and education, anti-Blackness, and the way that Black people are treated differently is just very prevalent in our society.
Yeah, and it's very obvious in some cases, like when we see it on video or we hear it. And then it's very nuanced and not obvious in other cases. And I think that is where a lot of the work is, because it's when we make these great big claims like, we're not racist and we don't identify with, typical like mass media representations of racism. But actually the real work is digging into, how does racism show up in my life every day? Like in how I operate in the world, at work, in my family, in my community.
Right. And that is the hard part, right? Because then we have to really start calling out people that we love, and it might be difficult, and there might be, a fight. It might get ugly, but these are things that we have to do if I care about you.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated with this discussion of dominant culture and dominant groups and identities. And, you sort of started this conversation with sharing how you identify. And in this training that we took yesterday, or recently, the whiteness at work training, they really focused on let's explain what dominant culture is. Let's explain what white dominant culture is. And then they really went into, which I loved, was this sort of analysis of dominant group behavior and non-dominant group behavior. And so the dominant group, say white people, heterosexual people, they named a lot of different groups. They're really unaware of their quote unquote groupness. So whereas a non-dominant group, a Black, Indigenous, woman of color, or people of color, or, LGBTQ plus, all of the non-dominant group, they're constantly aware of their groupness. And that was sort of what you identified as identifying the otherness, right? When did you really notice that you were in that otherness? And I think it's really worth looking at the difference between how the dominant group views themselves versus the non-dominant group. That was really eye-opening for me.
Definitely. Yeah. And that was where I started to realize again, back to the stages, I can definitely see myself on both sides of the fence on all of those, because every single time that, like she said, when I walk into a space, I really observe who is in my surroundings. That's a huge part of it, because I think, again, people can really take a look at that and understand where they fall in dominant and non-dominant culture. And
yeah. And they actually outlined some of those groups. So they said race, gender, citizenship status, sexual orientation. So for listeners, if you're identifying with these groups, it's really interesting to start thinking okay, am I aware of my identity in these groups? And then the other thing that was really interesting for me, and I think helpful, was dominant groups tend to say, look how much progress has been made. We've heard that in the feminist movement. We've heard it in racial justice movements. We've heard it in so many areas. Look how much progress has been made. You should be happy. Whereas the non-dominant group is saying, there's such a long way to go. We're so not there. And that was a really clear distinction for me.
Yeah, definitely. And, like I mentioned earlier, I feel like this for me has been a long time coming. And so it's a really, really exciting time to see people who aren't normally vocal about issues like this, really joining conversations. And at a national scale, I can't really even explain, because it's just so much information and such a long time coming that I really I feel the sentiment, I feel like there is still so much work to be done, but we have to celebrate our successes along the way to keep us going and to keep us re-energized and to keep us moving in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on something that you also brought up about having difficult conversations with people, that, it's like you said, you're used to having some of these conversations, but not with certain people, right? That's the big shift right now. And what really struck me in the whiteness at work training was how they said, call people in instead of calling people out, so that we're bringing people into the conversation I really liked their message of like compassion and love, like do it lovingly. We don't need to recreate like a white supremacist structure within our conversations, right?
Right. And then it kind of started to talk about perfectionism, which really stood out to me as well, because she said that perfectionism is a tool of white supremacy. And
yeah, if I can't do it right, I won't do it at all.
Right. And I think as a team, in reference to our team, I have been really trying to work on that as well. Because all of us have different strengths and different weaknesses. And I think if just taking that step in doing the work is really where it all starts. And you just keep the foot on the gas.
Yeah, that was a hard lesson for me early in my career about like doing everything perfectly and confusing like making a mistake with being a mistake and like taking it really personally. Like I am just an awful person because I didn't do this perfectly. Whereas that is a tool of oppression, just what you were just saying.
Right. And it's, again, a daily, every day, it's something that, we have to be aware of and we have to work on. And so I know another thing that stood out regarding the white racial identity development was leverage your skills for the movement. And so it's, again, I really want to take the time to acknowledge the privilege that I do have and being able to complete school, and having to have that opportunity is just something I'm really grateful for. Yeah. I just can't say that enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that struck me was when Jessica Fish was speaking, and she's the white trainer. There's two trainers, and she's white woman trainer and very experienced in racial justice training and work. And she was explaining her own experience as a white girl, not having had any contact with Black people, which I found actually really, I couldn't relate to that at all. Being a white woman, I was like really interested in that because I grew up in New Mexico. And as we know, the population of Black people is very, very small here. But even in New Mexico, my first grade teacher was a Black woman, and she made a huge impact on my life. Like she is the teacher that I look back on that like changed the direction of my life.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I didn't relate at all to her experience as a white girl growing up and not having any contact with Black culture. But I understand that a lot of people do have that experience. I just didn't relate to that because of Mrs. Ross and her orange pantsuit. And I loved her. I remember her so clearly. And, but again, yeah, it was like, it is a very distinct memory I have of a Black person. It wasn't like I didn't have a lot of Black people around me. But anyway, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Think of my experience as I began to work on my critical consciousness back in, my undergrad at UNM. I found myself noticing and counting the number of Black people or people of color in my classrooms. And that experience is just really awakening too, because, here we are in New Mexico and we're really multiracial. And at the same time, depending on the space that you're in, it's really not.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting way to start just observing your spaces and observing who is around you, and creating diversity along your friends and your family and your coworkers. And it's just so important.
Right. And that goes to the stage 1 of the liberatory consciousness framework, which is awareness, right? Like, okay, how many people are on my staff? How many people are in my company that are Black or people of color? or indigenous. And so that's the whole awareness piece, right? That we have to do before we can even do the analysis or take the appropriate action. So, well, Angelica,
yeah, and constantly revisiting that, I think too. It's like you never really the fourth step isn't the last step, because you're always going to be constantly going through these steps to continue to be anti-racist. That's what I will say. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just for listeners that are interested, we do have resources at the website, wellwomanlife.com/anti-racism. There are so many resources out there, and I get that. There's so many lists and things, but I do feel like we're curating a list that is specifically interesting for intersectional feminism, for women. And Angelica, do you have anything that you want to talk about as far as resources to add to our growing resource list?
Yeah, it's a really great list already. I will tell you that. And the two most recent items that I'm learning about, or I watched Just Mercy, and that's a story about Brian Stevenson. And it was just a really amazing way to understand the inequality of the justice system. And then a book I just started to read is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Mm-hmm. And so those are just, I meant to mention that earlier, and just those are right now my grounding where I am, the most recent. Okay. But I'm definitely going to get you a list with some references. I would definitely say to follow Tamika D. Mallory on social media. And my mentor is Drea Beta, the YouTube academic. She has a YouTube page, okay. And she does a daily video called the Abeta Reality Dose. And so she just touches on some really amazing topics. And I'll be sending you some resources to add, definitely.
Okay. So definitely head over to wellwomanlife.com/anti-racism to get all of those links and resources that we've been putting together and that Angelica is adding to. And I'm reading right now, I just started it, so I can't really say anything much about it yet, but I'm reading Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. And so I'm excited to share about that on future episodes. And thank you for having this conversation. Are there any last calls to action or thoughts that you want to share before we...
The last one I will say is that, right now here in Albuquerque, we do actually have a political prisoner by the name of Clifton White, who could definitely use some support, some calls to everybody in leadership to help get justice for Clifton White as well. He's a local man who has been organizing for Black Lives Matter. And so I think it's really important for us to stay focused on our local organizers as well.
Okay. And we can put that in the show notes as well at wellwomanlife.com/podcast. You can go there and get all the links and we'll put a link into the framework we talked about and all kinds of things. So thank you, Angelica, for this awesome conversation.
Thank you so much, Giovanna, for creating this space again. It's really amazing. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
That's it for our show today. Remember, if you need support to live your Well Woman life, head over to wellwomanlife.com/Facebook to join our community. There's a list of anti-racism resources at wellwomanlife.com/anti-racism. And you can check out all the past episodes of the Well Woman Show featuring Black, Indigenous, and women of color at wellwomanlife.com/women of color. As a reminder, we are on NPR every week, so be sure to tune in at npr.org/podcasts and search for The Well Woman Show. If you enjoyed today's show, please take a moment and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave a review. This helps raise visibility, which is super helpful when it comes to producing the show every week. For feedback, comments, or just to let me know you were listening, find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Well Woman Life. I'm Giovanna Rossi for The Well Woman Show. Until next time, have a super powerful week.